Hi, just a quick reminder that this podcast has merch, a Patreon, a Fiverr gig, and some affiliated links. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. Alright, now enjoy the show. I have to give a content warning. In this episode, abortion and alcohol abuse are mentioned. So, listener discretion is advised. On an autumn day in 1914, a baby boy was born in Wales. A boy that was raised in a typical 20th century family, surrounded by people who coddled and shielded him from the world. A boy that would still grow up to become a tortured poet, and who would leave behind works that would be celebrated for decades to come. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 12th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. Welcome to season 5 of History Shelf. This season is titled History, Taylor's version. That is because these 14 people that I will be covering this season all have one thing in common. The one thing they have in common is they all have been name dropped in a Taylor Swift song. Now, don't stop listening if you are not a fellow Swiftie like me. This season is not going to be about Taylor Swift. You don't have to be a Swiftie to enjoy this season. You just have to be a history lover. So please, stay. What we are going to do is you and I are going to go on a little adventure that spans 2,404 years. Who I am going to cover this season are fearless leaders, people from the screen, poets straight from the Tortured Poets department, and people who were just trying to find a place in this world. Some of these stories may be stories of happiness. They may be sad, beautiful, tragic. But long story short, I hope that you will be enchanted to get to know the stories of these historical figures all too well. So, are you ready for it? For this week, I am talking about Dylan Thomas. Dylan Marlys Thomas was born on October 27, 1914 in Upland, Swansea, Wales. Dylan's name is really pronounced Dylan. That is the Welsh pronunciation of his name, but Dylan preferred the English pronunciation. He would even correct radio broadcasts when they used the Welsh pronunciation, so I am going to use the English pronunciation of his name for this episode. Dylan's mother was Florence Hannah Williams, and his father was David John Thomas. Dylan had one sibling. He had an older sister named Nancy. Dylan's father was an English literature professor, and his father would often recite the works of History Shelf alumni William Shakespeare. This would spark a love in Dylan for rhythmic ballads. He would become a big fan of Gerard Manley Hopkins, W.B. Yeats, and Edgar Allan Poe. Growing up, Dylan was surrounded by people that spoke Welsh. Dylan may have been able to speak a little Welsh, but English was his first language. Some sources say that he didn't know any Welsh. The 1921 census said that he did. Some people said that they heard him speak a little in Welsh, and they also heard him sing in Welsh. Now, just because he knew how to sing in Welsh does not mean that he necessarily knew how to speak in Welsh. I learned Latin songs in high school for chorus, and I can't speak Latin. I can't translate those songs that I spent 4 years singing, so singing and speaking are different. During his childhood, Dylan's time was divided up between Swansea and the countryside of Carmarthenshire. His aunt, Anne Jones, and her husband, Jim Jones, no, not the cult leader, owned a farm in the countryside. Dylan even wrote a poem about it titled Fern Hill. That wouldn't be the only poem that he would write. He would actually go on to become a famous poet. He is known as the most famous Welsh poet, even though he wrote in English. He would write most of his famous poems when he was just a teenager. When he was around 16, he began copying his early poems into what would become known as his notebooks. He would continue this practice until 1934, and this contributed to several of his first collections, beginning with 18 poems published in 1934. In 1931, Dylan was 16 years old, and like someone else that I've already covered this season, Bonnie Parker, Dylan dropped out of school. Though he didn't follow up dropping out of school with going on a crime spree a few years later. No, Dylan dropped out of school so he could go work as a junior reporter at the South Wales Daily Post, which shows you just how much times have changed. There's no way that a 16-year-old dropout would be hired at any publication today. Dylan didn't stay there long, though. He quit in December of 1932. He quit because he no longer wanted to focus his attention on journalism. He wanted to get back to his true passion, poetry. Though he did continue to work as a freelance journalist when he needed to. Something else that was important to Dylan was the theater. He was an actor, writer, producer, and set painter at Swansea Little Theatre Company. With his artistic friends, Dylan would frequent pubs and cafes in Swansea. This group was known as the Cardamom Gang. It was in honor of one of their favorite places, the Cardamom Cafe. Around this time was when Dylan's poetry career really kicked off. In 1933, Dylan's poem, And Death Shall Have No Dominion, was published in the New English Weekly. This was his first international publication. This sent Dylan to London for the summer of 1933 so he could meet with editors and English literary magazines. He was just 18 years old when this happened. In 1934, Dylan moved to London. The poet Victor Newbery edited a section called The Poet's Corner in a British newspaper called the Sunday Referee. Victor awarded weekly prizes. Dylan was the winner of one of those prizes. The publisher of the Sunday Referee then sponsored and Victor arranged for Dylan's first book, 18 Poems, to be published in December of 1934. This did not bring Dylan any money, though. This was a vanity publisher, so they didn't pay Dylan. They actually expected the writer to buy a certain number of copies. But even though Dylan didn't make any money off of 18 poems, it did get him noticed by the literary world. Critics praised it. Poets Edwin Muir and Edith Sitwell were among his fans. And if the name Sitwell sounds familiar to you, it's probably because I mentioned Edith's brothers, Osbert and Cerebral, in the Siegfried Sassoon episode last season. T.S. Eliot, Geoffrey Grinson, and Stephen Spender were also some poets that took notice of Dylan's talent. Dylan was different from his contemporaries like T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden. His poetry was not about social and intellectual issues. His writing exhibited intense lyricism and highly charged emotion. He had more in common with romantic tradition. This is how Dylan describes his writing style. Quote, I make one image, though make is not the right word. I let perhaps an image be made emotionally in me and then apply to it what intellectual and critical forces I possess. Let it breed another, let that image contradict the first, make of the fourth contradictory image, and let them all within my imposed formal limits conflict. End quote. So, when Dylan was growing up, he was surrounded by people that did things for him. He was babied. His mother and his aunts babied him. So when Dylan went to dinner with his friend Vernon Watkins at Vernon's aunt's house, Dylan had to have Vernon's aunt cut the top of his boiled egg because he didn't know how to, because his mother had done that for him. Later in life, Dylan's wife, Caitlin, more on her later, would have to cut the top of his egg. Now, don't ask me why someone didn't just teach the man how to do it himself. When Dylan published his collection of poetry titled 25 Poems, he received critical praise for it. In 1938, Dylan won the Oscar Blumenthal Prize for Poetry. He was also published in the US that year. By this time, Dylan had become a heavy drinker. In the late 1930s, Dylan caught the attention of the New Apocalyptics. The New Apocalyptics were a group of English poets. Their work acted against political realism in poetry. They were influenced by surrealism and expressionism. The New Apocalyptics were also influenced by Dylan. But Dylan refused to align himself with them, and he did not sign their manifesto. He thought they were, quote, intellectual mugpots leaning on a theory, end quote. The group still continued to be influenced by Dylan's work. Where Dylan stood politically was far left. He was a pacifist and he was anti-fascist. He was a supporter of the No More War movement. So, if we think back to the previous people that I have covered on this podcast, I feel like his political views would closely align with Sigfrid Sassoon's, which Dylan and Sigfrid were alive during the same time. He definitely wouldn't have aligned with Salvador Dali's political views, another person that was also alive during Dylan's lifetime. I said earlier that I would talk more about Dylan's wife later. So, let's talk about her. Who was she? Well, her name was Caitlin McNamara. Caitlin was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed dancer. Dylan met her in 1936. She was 2 years older than Dylan. They met in the Wheatsheaf pub in London's West End. They were introduced by Augustus John. He was a painter. Augustus was also Caitlin's lover. Now, before you go feeling sorry for Augustus because Dylan stole his girl, you should know that Augustus was a sleazeball. He was a friend of Caitlin's father who thought that sleeping with teenage girls was a perk of his artistic genius. Dylan and Caitlin were enchanted with each other from the moment that they met. It seems that they both sort of turned their meeting into a myth. There is a version of their meeting that claims that Dylan laid in Caitlin's lap while he was drunk and proposed marriage to her. One version of the story has them instantly going to bed together in a room above the nearby Eiffel Tower restaurant and charging it to Augustus' account. Both Dylan and Caitlin believed that they had found their soulmate in each other. They began writing to each other while Caitlin was still in a relationship with Augustus, but she did eventually end her relationship with him, and she started dating Dylan in the second half of 1936. Dylan and Caitlin were married on July 11th, 1937, at the Register Office in Penzance, Cornwall, England. But Dylan and Caitlin's love story was treacherous. For a little while after their marriage, Dylan and Caitlin had to go to Wales to live with Dylan's parents because they had no money. In May of 1938, they rented a cottage in Wales in the village of Larne. They lived there intermittently until July of 1941. Their first child was born on January 30th, 1939. It was a boy named Llewellyn. They would go on to have two more children, a daughter named Adonway, born on March 3rd, 1943, and another son born on July 25th, 1949, named Colm. Though Caitlin only gave birth to 3 children by Dylan, in total she gave birth to 4 babies in her life. She would have another baby after Dylan's death. But she was pregnant more than 4 times. More than once, Dylan and Caitlin scraped together what little money they had so Caitlin could have an expensive and an illegal abortion. When World War II broke out in 1939, Dylan did not have to serve because he had asthma. Dylan found work writing scripts for Strand Films and for BBC Radio. It was the first time that he made a living wage. To avoid heavy bombing, Dylan and Caitlin rented a cottage in New Quay on Cardigan Bay. Dylan's old school friend and maybe old flame, Vera Phillips, was also there. Vera was married to an army captain named William Killick. Dylan had actually been the best man at their wedding. While William was away at war, it is possible that Vera was financially supporting Dylan and Caitlin with William's army pay. When William came home from war because he was suffering from PTSD, he was angry that he had been taking care of Dylan and Caitlin. And it's possible that Dylan may have also been sleeping with Vera. William found Dylan in a local pub called the Black Lion. There was a fight that broke out between the two men. William then got a machine gun and started filling Dylan and Caitlin's cottage walls full of bullets. Then William came in with a hand grenade and threatened to detonate it. Dylan persuaded William to leave. William was charged with attempted murder, but because he was a war hero, he was acquitted. Dylan and Caitlin left New Quay, and their friendship with William and Vera was never the same. Dylan continued to drink, and the couple continued to struggle with money. Caitlin would get angry because she felt that her artistic abilities were squandered in years of impoverished domesticity. This would lead her to have sexual affairs outside of their marriage. Caitlin's sexual promiscuity really came to a head after Dylan's death, though. She would have orgies with the local men in Larne. But Caitlin wasn't the only one in their marriage that had illicit affairs. Dylan got around too, including with a 19-year-old woman named Pamela Glendower. Dylan had an affair with her when he was 29 in early of 1943, though at the time her name was Pamela Phillips. She actually came up with the last name Glendower after World War II. Pamela said that Dylan had a fear of being alone, especially at night. She said that he would dream of mice and vampires. There was one night that he was frightened and touched Pamela and called her Caitlin. He would actually talk about Caitlin a lot to her. Dylan's affairs would either fizzle out or Caitlin would find out about them and she would make him end them. Dylan and Caitlin fought a lot. Not only did Dylan like alcohol, but so did Caitlin. Dylan described their relationship as a, quote, raw, red, bleeding meat, end quote. In 1939, Dylan published The Map of Love. It was a collection of 16 poems and 7 short stories. Then in 1940, he published 10 stories in the book Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog. But those books didn't pay the creditors that were hounding him. He relied heavily on borrowing money from his friends and acquaintances. And you would think, since he heavily relied on his friends' wallets, that he would make sure that he was an excellent friend, but that wasn't always the case. Dylan was supposed to be the best man at his friend Vernon Watkins' wedding, but on the day of the wedding, Dylan just didn't show up. Due to Dylan's money problems, Dylan and his family had to move in with the critic John Davenport. Together, Dylan and John wrote the satire, The Death of the King's Canary, but that wasn't published until 1976 because of fears of libel. Dylan began scripting films for the Ministry of Information. Dylan would often perform the scripts that he wrote for film and radio. His radio play Under Milkwood was decades later turned into a movie that starred the actor Richard Burton. And I will just tell you this now, Richard Burton will be the subject of next week's episode. In February of 1941, Dylan was heartbroken when Swansea was bombed in a 3-night blitz. He walked through the town after the bombing with his friend Bert Trick. The Cardamom Cafe was destroyed, and Dylan said, quote, "Our Swansea is dead," end quote. Like Sigrid Sassoon, Dylan was affected by war. He even let it start to influence his poetry. His war poems were collected in Deaths and Entrances, published in 1946. He received a lot of critical acclaim for that. After World War II, Dylan continued to work in film. He found work at Welsh BBC. He made over 100 broadcasts for them. He did poetry readings, discussions, and critiques. In 1945, Dylan began reading for the BBC radio program Book of Verse. He finally found steady work. Because of the job, he also became drinking buddies with the poet and playwright Lewis MacNeice. His drinking problem kept him from getting a staff job at BBC. In September of 1945, Dylan and his wife and children left Wales and moved to London to live with various friends. In 1947, he was awarded a Society of Authors scholarship. In May of 1949, Dylan and his family moved back to Larne. They lived in a boathouse, and this was Dylan's last home. In February of 1950, Dylan started doing reading tours with the poet John Brennan. This took Dylan to America. He would drink on these tours, and he would show up at parties and events drunk. He would even show up to readings under the influence of alcohol, though he may have just been pretending to be drunk. In January of 1951, he went to Iran to work on a film for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The film was never made, but there was a documentary made this year in 2024 about Dylan going to Iran, and it is called Pouring Water on Troubled Oil. Later, in 1951, Dylan published one of, if not his most famous poem, Do Not Go Gentle in That Good Night. I know that was my first exposure to him. The poem was referenced in the YA dystopian series Matched, and that's where I first read it. Dylan took a second tour to America in 1952. This time, Caitlin joined him because she found out that on his first tour, he slept with any pretty girl that was willing. He suffered with gout and lung problems on this tour. His lung problems were not helped by the fact that he smoked a lot. Dylan's last collection of poetry was called Collected Poems, and it was published on November 10th, 1952. It won the Foyle Poetry Prize. Critic Philip Toynbee said that Dylan was the greatest living poet in the English language. The winter of 1952, going into spring of 1953, was a hard time for Dylan. His father died of pneumonia just before Christmas. His sister died of liver cancer in the spring of 1953. One of his patrons overdosed, and 3 of his friends died young. Caitlin also had one of her abortions that year. Dylan did a third tour in America in 1953, this time sans Caitlin. During this tour, he was working on his play Under Milkwood. A work-in-progress version of the play was performed on May 3rd at Harvard University. A week later, it was performed with a full cast at the Poetry Center in New York. The poet John Brennan's assistant, Elizabeth Reitel, locked Dylan in a room so he could finish the script. He finished the script as the actors were putting on their makeup. On this tour, Dylan met with the composer Igor Stravinsky. They talked about working together. That would never happen, though. Dylan spent about the last of his 10 days on the tour with Elizabeth Reitel. He was having an affair with her. It was during this time that Dylan fractured his arm because he fell down some stairs because he was drunk. While at the doctor's, he was also treated for gout and gastritis. Dylan's fourth U.S. tour started on October 9th, 1953. By this time, Dylan's health was in terrible condition. He had coughing fits, blackout spells, and he was having trouble breathing. Dylan landed in New York on October 20th, 1953. John Brennan did not come this time, but he did send his assistant, Elizabeth. On October 23rd, 1953, Dylan was at rehearsal for Under Milkwood, and he started to shiver and run a fever before he collapsed on stage. Now, what I'm about to tell you is going to be a series of people making terrible decisions and just fucking up and neglecting Dylan. Elizabeth took Dylan to get cortisone injections from a doctor named Milton Feltenstein the next day. Milton thought that Dylan had delirium tremens that is usually caused by alcohol withdrawal. Dylan collapsed again later that night. The next day, he was too ill to speak. Air pollution in New York was really bad during this time. Over 200 people died from smog in November of 1953. So that was not helping the situation. What else was not helping the situation was Dylan. On November 3rd, he went out for drinks 3 different times. He said that he had 18 whiskeys at one bar, but the barman said that he had like half that. Everyone around him could see that he was in bad shape, but they didn't really do anything. The next day, he went out drinking again. His doctor kept giving him cortisone injections because he thought that that cured just about everything. He also gave him morphine. The doctor gave him 3 times more than he should have, and let me remind you, Dylan was already struggling to breathe, so I think you probably know where this is going. Elizabeth was with Dylan, and she called the painter, Jack Helliker, to come help her. Dylan started turning blue in the early morning of November 5th, so Elizabeth called the cortisone doctor. He came over, and then he called an ambulance. An hour later, Dylan was at St. Vincent's Hospital, even though it was only a few blocks away from where Dylan was staying. Dylan was comatose. The hospital thought that he had brain damage due to alcohol. The cortisone doctor then stepped in and took over, even though he did not have admitting rights at the hospital. The brain specialist wasn't called to look at Dylan until 36 hours after he was admitted. Caitlin flew over and showed up at the hospital and asked, quote, "Is the bloody man dead yet?" End quote. She left, got drunk, returned to the hospital, and started making threats to John Brennan. The cortisone doctor then had her put in a straitjacket and committed to the Rivercrest Sanitarium. Dylan died at St. Vincent's at noon on November 9th, 1953. He was 39 years old. Dylan had bronchitis, pneumonia, emphysema, and asthma when he was admitted to the hospital. After his death, it went around that he died due to alcohol, but that was not the case. His post-mortem found 3 causes of death: pneumonia, brain swelling, and a fatty liver, but there was no cirrhosis. There has been a lot of speculation around who is to blame for Dylan's death because there was clear negligence. Was it the hospital? Was it the cortisone doctor? Was it Elizabeth? I kind of feel like everyone around him failed him. Many biographies have been written about Dylan, and his biographers, Andrew Sinclair and George Tremlett, don't think that Dylan was an alcoholic at all, and they think that he had undiagnosed diabetes. Dylan died without a will and with 100 pounds to his name. He was buried in the village courtyard at Larne. Caitlin was buried beside him when she died in 1994, even though she remarried. In 1955, John Brennan wrote a biography about Dylan that painted him as a drunk and doomed poet. Since his death, people have questioned Dylan's greatness. This started to happen actually towards the end of his life. Some don't see Dylan as a poet, but rather an entertainer. But there are still quite a few out there that stand by Dylan's work. In Swansea, there is a Dylan Thomas Theater, and there is a Dylan Thomas Center, and there is also an annual Dylan Thomas Festival. Outside of the Dylan Thomas Center, there is a bronze statue of Dylan. There is also a monument to Dylan in Comduncan Park. It is a small rock in an enclosed garden within the park. It has the closing lines from Fern Hill inscribed on it. Quote, "Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea." End quote. The boathouse, the last home Dylan had, is now a museum run by Carmarthenshire County Council. He also had a writing shed, and that has been preserved. The Dylan Thomas Prize was created in his honor. It is awarded to the best published writer in English under 30. There is a Dylan Thomas Screenplay Award. There is a plaque at Westminster Abbey that has inscribed the last two lines of Fern Hill. Dylan has also been on a UK postage stamp. The movies The Edge of Love, Set Fire to the Sea, and Dominion are about Dylan. BBC also did a film called Dylan, Life and Death of a Poet. That is about him. So is the TV drama A Poet in New York. The plays Dylan and Dylan Thomas Return Journey are about Dylan. Many artists have been inspired by his works. There are too many to list here. And Taylor Swift's song, The Tortured Poets Department, mentions Dylan. It is the title track and track 2 off of Taylor Swift's 11th studio album, The Tortured Poets Department. And that was the life of Dylan Thomas. Thank you so much for listening to the 12th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf. Next week's episode is going to be about Richard Burton. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers. Plus, you'll get a handwritten note of thanks mail to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover. That is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers. Plus, you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the zip-up putty. You can also take out ad space. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. You can also click on one of the affiliate links and buy something, and that will help support the podcast. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. But if you don't want any of the merch or any of the perks and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is just to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.